Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 557, The Gods March Overseas, Part 3. In 1901, a Shinto shrine was erected in a very unusual place, Taipei, which is not, in fact, by the way, pronounced Taipei. That's an artifact of an older system of Romanizing Chinese. Anyway, Taipei is the northernmost and largest city on the island of Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, has a long and fascinating history all its own, very little of which has to do with Japan. It had been a peripheral outpost of the once mighty dynasties of Imperial China, the last marker on the road out of civilization and into the wide open ocean inhabited by barbarians. It had also been the home of the last outpost of ethnic Han Chinese rule during the rise of China's last imperial dynasty, the Qing, a dynasty formed by nomadic peoples called the Manchu, who are more closely related to the Mongols than to the Han Chinese majority. Taiwan had been the last outpost of the Ming Dynasty loyalists to the previous dynasty, who held out for decades under the rule of the pirate-turned-general Koxinga, who, by the way, was half Japanese on his mother's side. Koxinga's government on Taiwan, one could perhaps even call it some sort of renegade province, did eventually fall, and oh boy, let me tell you, there are plenty of folks in Beijing today who make great hay from that historical analogy. Once Taiwan was returned to the rule of the new mainland dynasty of the Qing, it remained a fairly sleepy backwater, divided between a Han Chinese settler population living on the coast and an aboriginal population that was not at all Chinese. They were descended from Austronesian seafarers who arrived in the area thousands of years earlier. The Han Chinese population would always remain very small relative to the size of the island for the entirety of the Qing dynasty period. The dynastic leadership in Beijing was much more concerned with its northern land frontier, with the nomadic tribes of Asia, and eventually the Russians, than its maritime borders, which until the 19th century were not really a source of concern at all. In terms of Taiwan, this meant limiting settlement by Han Chinese to avoid upsetting relations with the aboriginal tribes, so that in turn the dynasty could claim the island while also committing as few resources to it as possible. That policy would start to shift by the mid-1800s, as the threat of imperialism, at first from European powers like France, but eventually from Japan, grew. Chinese officials charged with securing the southern border began to worry that Taiwan's lightly populated status would make it comparatively easy for a foreign power to sweep in and occupy the island. And though they could never get the wide-ranging settlement and colonization initiatives they were hoping for off the ground, in the end, they were proven correct, which was probably a mixed comfort at best, if I'm honest. In 1894, Japan and the Qing dynasty of China went to war over their respective spheres of influence in Korea, and despite the predictions of many international observers, Japan won quite handily. As a part of that campaign, the Army and the Navy masterminded an invasion of Taiwan itself, and after the war, Japan claimed the island. The history of how Taiwan was treated under a half-century of Japanese rule is a complicated one. Again, that rule lasted for exactly half a century, from 1895 to 1945, and was both preceded and succeeded by some deeply complicated moments in the island's own history that in turn color how Japanese colonial rule is remembered. But what we're going to focus on this week is specifically the way in which Shinto as a religion, or in the eyes of the Japanese government as a cultural institution, operated on Taiwan, and what that reveals about the complexities of colonial rule. And that brings us back to that unusual shrine founded in Taipei in 1901, the first constructed under Japanese rule, though interestingly, not the first institution on Taiwan to be legally recognized as a Shinto shrine. We'll get to that in a second. Anyway, the shrine built in 1901 was Taiwan Jinja, or Taiwan Shrine, a greater imperial shrine of the same rank as Hokkaido and Kashihara shrines, built along the slopes of Jintian Mountain, just north of the Keelung River in northern Taipei. Of course, there's no Taiwan Jinja anymore. After the Second World War, when the island was handed back to the Republic of China, the shrine buildings were disassembled to help rebuild the war-torn city. The Taiwan Grand Hotel now stands on the former site of the shrine. Taiwan Shrine was intended to serve as the new island's first shrine, much in the same way that Hokkaido Shrine was supposed to be for that northern territory of Hokkaido. However, what exactly it commemorated was a little different, and here we need to take a brief detour into the history of the Japanese invasion of Taiwan. The conquest of Taiwan ended up taking slightly longer than the war between Japan and China did in its own right. Stiff resistance from the local population meant that even though the Qing dynasty formally gave up the island to Japan in May of 1895, the final armed revolts on the island itself weren't put down until November. And during that time, one of the Japanese commanders of the Taiwan expedition took ill, which, to be fair, didn't really make him unique at all. Far, far more Japanese soldiers died of illness caused by things like malaria than enemy action during this conflict, and I do mean far more. Japanese military casualties for the Taiwan invasion were 333 killed and 687 wounded in action, compared to 6,903 killed as a result of disease on the battlefield. What made this particular illness unusual was its pedigree. The patient in question was Kitashira Kawanomiya Yoshihisa Shinno, or to address him by his less verbose English title, Prince Yoshihisa. He was a general in the Imperial Japanese Army, as many imperial relatives were. Much like the royals of Europe, men were expected to serve as officers, and also a son of the Kita Shirakawa branch of the imperial line, a distant relative of the emperor, though his particular line had branched off several generations earlier, during the reign of the 115th emperor, Sakuramachi. Still, the fact that he was an imperial relative at all, and the fact that Prince Yoshihisa did in fact end up dying on Taiwan as a result of his illness, led to a sort of strange sanctification of the Taiwan campaign itself. A literal imperial prince had laid down his life to help Japan claim Taiwan, and that connection, at a time when veneration of the imperial family was an increasingly well-established part of the state ethos, well, that was a very heady one. And so the spirit of Yoshihisa himself was enshrined in Taiwan Shrine, the better to help oversee in the afterlife the place he had given his life to help claim for the empire. The Kaitaku Sanjin, or Three Pioneer Gods, were also enshrined at Taiwan Shrine. As a reminder, these are Okuninushi, who is the ruler of the earth before its subjugation by Takemikazuchi at the order of the sun goddess Amaterasu, as well as Sukuna Hikona, an agriculture god, and Kunitama, a provincial protector god. In fact, a big part of the delay in constructing the shrine, which was first conceived in 1896 but took 5 more years, was a 3-way debate between the newly appointed governors general of Taiwan, all military figures, the National Diet back in Tokyo, and the Home Ministry, which was supposed to supervise the colony, but had limited control over the military-dominated government on the island, all of whom had different views on who should go into the shrine. The Taiwanese government general wanted Prince Yoshihisa, the Home Ministry wanted the Three Pioneer Gods, the Diet was divided, and so of course they solved the issue with that most classic political solution: why don't we just do both? Still, Yoshihisa always got far more attention than the Three Pioneer Gods because of his role in conquering the island. In addition to Taiwan Shrine itself, places he visited during the island's conquest would eventually be picked out with historical markers or made into smaller shrines in their own rights. Taiwan Shrine's own materials reflect this. A written history of the shrine, published in 1935, dedicated 7 pages to describing the Three Pioneer Gods, compared to 32 pages on Prince Yoshihisa, and, by the way, other than dying on Taiwan, the most historically significant thing Prince Yoshihisa ever did was being one of the last members of the imperial family to stick by the Tokugawa shogunate as it was collapsing in the 1860s, so not something this pamphlet really spent all that much time talking about. He's a hard guy to pump out 32 pages of information about, is what I'm getting at here. The main way the shrine's writers got around this was by playing up an allegorical comparison to Prince Yoshihisa's most famous ancestor, another man who, at least supposedly, had traveled from his home to a new place overseas, there to subjugate it and bring it, in air quotes, civilization. That ancestor, of course, was Emperor Jimmu, who in the ancient mytho-histories relocated from his home in Kyushu to central Honshu, specifically, of course, Kashihara, and there directed the pacification of the empire. Yoshihisa, according to Taiwan Shrine, had done the same thing for the benighted peoples of Taiwan, and his death was transformed into this martyr-like act, the culmination of the successful project of civilizing Taiwan. Except, of course, Taiwan already had a civilization. Well, really, it had two, given that both the Han Chinese and the Aboriginal communities on Taiwan both predated the Japanese. And Taiwan Shrine and the Japanese government general on Taiwan more broadly couldn't be entirely dismissive of that fact. European imperialists during the 19th and early 20th centuries often couched their imperial actions in a desire to civilize wholly barbaric parts of the world, the classic example of that idea being the famous poem The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Japanese imperialists, however, often justified Japan's overseas colonial ventures by pointing to cultural continuities with the cultures they were colonizing, saying that Japan's shared cultural heritage with other parts of Asia made it, so to speak, the right nation for the job of bringing civilization to the rest of Asia, whether the locals wanted it or not. So being entirely dismissive of the existing Chinese culture on Taiwan wasn't really as much of an option for Japanese leaders during the colonial period. That's particularly true on Taiwan compared to, say, Hokkaido, because Han Chinese and Aboriginals made up the majority of the island's population throughout the colonial period, compared to Hokkaido, where the Ainu were already, by the time of Japan's colonization, a shrinking minority. So how does a religious or cultural site like Taiwan Shrine navigate this complexity? Well, by incorporating some Chinese elements into its practices. Of course, on a theological level, Taiwan Shrine remained staunchly Shinto, and did not incorporate specific practices either from religious Taoism or Confucianism, at least not beyond references to broad principles, or anything from what we might call Chinese folk religion, the complex pantheon of gods and heroes from Chinese myth. However, much of its aesthetic presentation allowed for Chinese influence. For example, if you've ever been to a Shinto shrine, you've seen statues of the Koma-inu, often translated into English as lion dogs, usually two statues flanking the torii gates at the shrine entrance. The Taiwan Jingu Koma-inu were designed to incorporate more Chinese aesthetic influence, and in particular to look like these stone lions you see at many Chinese temples, which, yes, are likely where Koma-inu come from in the first place. And as an aside, you can actually still see the Taiwan Jingu Koma-inu. They're still in Taipei, out front of the Taiwan Grand Hotel, so you can go see them if you want. Taiwan Shrine's first festival in 1901 made similarly symbolic nods to the locals. Many of the attendees included Han Chinese elites from Taipei society, many of whom in turn were dressed in Chinese formal wear. The festival itself involved offerings of poetry to the shrine, much of which was composed in Chinese, not Japanese. At least one of the Japanese speakers gave a speech entirely in Chinese, and the shrine rituals, carefully recorded in its official records, included Chinese language summaries of the rituals as well. These were nods to the existing Han community on Taiwan, certainly more than the Ainu got in Hokkaido, but you won't be shocked to learn that they, along with a bevy of other shrine materials intended to suggest that Chinese Confucianism and Shinto represented the same basic morality, though Shinto's was, of course, more evolved, did not succeed in winning over huge numbers of new adherents or parishioners from amongst the Han Chinese population. But then again, that was never really the point. The Taiwanese scholar Tsai Chin-tong, whose main focus was Japan's religious policies in occupied Taiwan, divided the history of those policies into three main eras. The first of these eras, which ranged from the island's conquest and annexation in 1895 through the founding of Taiwan Shrine in 1901 and all the way to 1915, was a period of what you might call indirect rule. Taiwan was Japan's first overseas colony with a large existing population. At least according to the government, neither the Ainu in Hokkaido nor the Ryukyuans in what's now Okinawa Prefecture counted in that regard. And so initially there was some legal uncertainty as to what Taiwan's actual status should be. In 1905, the National Diet, the parliament, resolved that Taiwan should be managed differently from the home islands given its unique status. Laws from the home islands should be the model, but the Taiwanese government general, dominated by the military and still led at this point by either admirals or generals, should have a lot of leeway to set independent policy. For the most part, in turn, those generals and admirals were happy to leave well enough alone as long as the locals didn't kick up trouble. They viewed Taiwan mostly as a strategic bastion in the region and an economic cash cow, and didn't really want to get too into the weeds on anything that didn't directly relate to either of those two issues. This meant that in terms of the existing population, the island's rulers were generally more focused on Taiwan's aboriginal population, which proved rather less compliant to Japanese rule than the government general had hoped. More on that in a bit. As for the Han Chinese, they proved a pretty easy population to govern. Many of them had come to Taiwan in the first place to get away from the mainland government, and were not particularly attached to it, especially when the Japanese government general announced that most existing legislation governing their lives wouldn't change at all. What attempts there were to alter the lives of the Han Chinese inhabitants of Taiwan were generally pretty superficial in terms of practical change. For example, remember how I said Taiwan Shrine was the first Shinto shrine built on Taiwan, but not the first one recognized? That's because in 1897, just 2 years into the period of colonial rule, the government general declared an existing religious site to be a Shinto shrine. This is what's known as Kokshinga Shrine in Tainan, on the south end of the island, built all the way back in the 1700s by descendants of the pirate-turned-Ming loyalists who'd ruled Taiwan as a breakaway state during his lifetime. His followers and descendants had built a temple as a monument to him. That temple, in turn, was preserved even after the island was conquered by the Qing dynasty. And by the way, the term used for that sort of institution in Chinese is sumiao, or jibyo in Japanese. I'm going to say mausoleum to clarify the distinction between this and a Shinto shrine. In 1896, one of the first acts of the newly appointed Japanese governor-general of the city of Tainan, Isogai Seizo, was to request that this mausoleum be recognized as a Shinto shrine. His thinking appears to have been threefold. First and most obviously, even 300 years after his death, Kokshinga was a popular figure on Taiwan, and so making use of that popularity made sense. Second, Kokshinga's story actually had some interesting parallels to our old friend Prince Yoshihisa. Both men had conquered the island of Taiwan, and then actually died as a result of malaria, and oh boy, that's a commonality we can make some really good hay off of. Third, and probably most importantly, the Chinese practice of ancestor veneration at mausoleums was, according to both Isogai and many other Japanese serving in Taiwan's government, recognizably parallel to parts of Shinto practice. After all, more than a few of the kami venerated at Shinto shrines, including at Taiwan Shrine itself, were not gods in the traditional sense, but the spirits of heroic figures from the past. For example, Yamaguchi Toru, the main priest of Taiwan Shrine, would write in 1934 that both Shinto shrines and the mausoleums of Taiwan were based on the same, quote, oriental morality, unquote, of veneration for ancestors. He repeatedly enjoined Japanese residents of Taiwan to show the same respect to Taiwanese mausoleums that they did to Shinto shrines, for this very reason. Officials in the government general appear to have shared this view. Many of them made formal ritual visits to Taiwanese mausoleums and offered those places financial support, particularly ones associated with Confucius, whose veneration is pretty common in China and who is, of course, as they say, kind of a big deal in the rest of Asia. Kimura Masaharu, one of the officials in charge of the Shrines and Temples section of the government general, would write that, quote, the temple mausoleums, those sumiao, are the shrines of the ethnic Han who came to this island, and shrines are the temple mausoleums of the ethnic Japanese. In other words, these institutions are two sides of the same coin. One of his colleagues, a governor for one of the island's districts called Miyazaki Naokatsu, took it a step further and argued that when Japan annexed Taiwan, Taiwanese ancestors and gods actually became Japanese kami. They had essentially been spiritually annexed into Japan and become a part of that nation's pantheon. What I'm getting at here is that there was broad support among the Japanese population for the suggestion that Koxinga's mausoleum be made into a shrine, and broadly for maintaining at least a degree of respect for other Han Chinese mausolea on the island. And so, in 1897, Koxinga's mausoleum was redesignated as Kaizan Jinja, and thus became Taiwan's first legal Shinto shrine. At first, this didn't really change that much. None of the buildings were replaced, and the monk who had looked after the shrine for decades at the behest of the Qing dynasty, whose name is Zheng Futian, was made into the new head priest of the shrine. But before long, some changes did start coming down. During the Qing period, the mausoleum expenses had been supported by nearby neighborhoods. They were pretty light. The mausoleum had occasional festivals, and that monk, Zheng, wasn't even full-time. However, the new rank of Kaizan Jinja as a provincial shrine required a full-time head priest and regular festivals, and so the old system was replaced by a governing shrine board of 3 Han Chinese and 3 Japanese to manage expenses, while government subsidies and donations, which were drawn from all over Tainan Prefecture, covered the costs of actually running the shrine. Despite these changes, Kaizan Jinja retained a pretty distinct Taiwanese style. For example, in 1930, the institution held a festival to celebrate its 270th anniversary, which began with the kami, in this case a Chinese-made image of Koxinga, paraded around in a palanquin in the Japanese style, surrounded by Shinto priests in their traditional outfits. But after that very Japanese opening, the rest of the celebration was local in style. After the palanquin, the somber taiko drumming accompanying it, all that stuff, came a bunch of Taoist musicians playing a mixture of metal bowls, drums, and fish blocks, among other things, more traditionally Taoist parade floats, things that were more traditionally Han in their religious practice. This is all, I think, a pretty good example of the Japanese government general's religious policies until 1915. Pretty hands-off. So what changed in 1915? Well, something called the Shilai Temple Incident, and if you know your Asian history, you know that anytime something gets innocuously labeled as an incident, it's probably a pretty big deal. This particular incident was a massive rebellion against Japanese rule on the islands. It's also sometimes called the Tapani Incident, after the place where its largest battle took place. The name Shilai Temple Incident, meanwhile, comes from the location where the Han Chinese side of the revolt began, because both the Han Chinese and Taiwan Aboriginals took up arms. The causes of the Shilai Temple Incident are really complicated. At some point, frankly, I might just do a whole episode on it. On the Han Chinese side, the rebellion is most associated with a guy named Yu Qingfang, a longtime anti-Japanese agitator who'd been arrested at least once in 1909 for involvement in anti-Japanese secret societies. He and his closest followers appear to have shared some pretty apocalyptic views about the rebellion. Their beliefs closely mirrored what you saw in the Yihechuan, or the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known in English as the Boxers, the religious movement behind the Boxer Rebellion in the Chinese mainland in 1900. Yu himself, at the start of the rebellion, declared himself Grand Marshal of the benevolent nation of the Great Ming, and appears to have wanted to create a new imperial dynasty on Taiwan. He and his followers believed a combination of magic amulets and a 49-day vegetarian diet would give them magical powers and immunity to most weapons, which is pretty similar to what you saw in the Boxer Rebellion. Those kind of beliefs were not at all uncommon at this point in Chinese folk religion. It's really interesting where that all is coming from, and we don't have any time really to get into it. Suffice it to say, this did not work, and frankly, most who were involved in the rebellion appear not to have bought too much into the religious side of it and have had much more mundane concerns. Among the majority of Taiwan's population, what actually drove the rebellion appears to have been excessive taxation as well as mistreatment of the Han population by the Japanese police. As one captured rebel put it, quote, "We now have to pay huge amounts of taxes, and all profitable enterprises have been monopolized by the Japanese. I couldn't take it anymore. If we could become a part of China again, we would no longer have to suffer like this." After the rebellion was crushed, and by the way, north of 1,000 Han Chinese and Taiwanese aboriginals died in the fighting, the Japanese death toll is not clear, the government general began a new and harsher crackdown on dissent in Taiwan. And of course, given the fact that a temple literally lent its name to the rebellion, part of that crackdown involved some closer looks at the island's religious institutions. In the aftermath, the government general began to expand its bureaucracy to include new sections devoted to managing Taiwan's religious institutions, which up until this point had largely been left alone, excepting, of course, those that were forcibly transformed into Shinto shrines. Taiwanese institutions came under increased scrutiny to ensure they were complying with more mundane laws, which actually could present a pretty big problem. Many of those religious institutions, for example, made extra money by hosting night markets, which the Japanese government had previously allowed to run, but then began to shut down for being unsanitary. Religious services and community organizations were increasingly monitored for potential subversive activity, and in 1923, the government general passed a new ordinance legally separating Shinto shrines from other religious institutions similar to the mainland, where, remember, Shinto shrines were secular cultural institutions governed differently from, say, a Buddhist temple or a church. Taiwan's government general maintained this exact same policy position and began to monitor local religious institutions to ensure they followed the rules for a religious institution. This meant they had to be staunchly apolitical, unlike a Shinto shrine, and they could not require any observances that would go against the duties of a good Japanese subject. Thus, for example, starting in the 1920s, all Taiwanese Taoist and Buddhist monks began to be required to make regular trips to Taiwan Shrine, an obligation that could legally be forced on them, even though they clearly had a religion they were already attached to. After all, visiting the shrine was not a religious requirement. It was a cultural obligation for any Japanese subject. Now, interestingly, these changes actually didn't generate that much pushback from the island's inhabitants. Why that is, of course, hard to say. Providing reasons for something that didn't happen is, by its nature, kind of a guessing game that's very challenging to win. We can certainly speculate. Perhaps all these religious leaders simply believed such pushback was unlikely to succeed. Perhaps they actually bought the rhetoric of cultural Shinto. It's really hard to say one way or the other. To be fair, likely part of the equation here is that the government general didn't completely abandon any attempt to be conciliatory towards the local population. For example, in 1928, it set up yet another new shrine, Kenko Jinja, in Taipei, which incidentally is often referred to by the Japanese pronunciation of Taihoku during this period, but I'm going to keep calling it Taipei. Kenko Jinja was intended to follow the model of the so-called Shokonsha shrines. These were shrines to console the spirits of the war dead, the most famous example being, of course, Tokyo's still extant and controversial Yasukuni Shrine. Unlike a traditional Shokonsha, however, Kenko Jinja didn't just enshrine members of the military who died on Taiwan. The government general opened it up to anyone who, quote, gave their life for this island's communal good. That included civil officials, neighborhood watch members, even teachers who died on the job. Why make that shift, something that didn't apply to any other Shokonsha in Japan? Again, we don't actually have a document that lays out the reasoning, but likely this was intended to be a bit of outreach to the local population, intended to inspire a feeling of belonging in the Japanese sphere. And as an aside, that desire to belong appears to have been pretty strong among the Taiwanese elite, at least. During the 1920s, there was a growing movement among the more educated and wealthy of the Taiwanese to demand a legally equal structure of government where Taiwan wouldn't be governed by a governor-general in an unaccountable way, but as a prefecture in a normal manner, with the ability to send representatives to the Diet, just like any other part of the home islands. There was actually a lot of debate on this issue, though as the 20s went on, the various other crises of the moment in Japanese history meant the Diet never really took it up and the whole movement never really went anywhere. Anyway, places like Kenko Jinja, Kenko Shrine, were probably intended to be a bit of a conciliatory gesture towards this movement. Certainly its architecture reflects that fact. The design of Kenko Shrine's torii gates included a Chinese-style tiled roof. The roof of the Honden, the main shrine building, was done in a similar way. The shrine's main architect, Ide Kaoru, claimed the hybrid design was intended to reflect the hybrid nature of the souls enshrined therein. After all, some of them were culturally Chinese, even if all were united in service to the empire. The last period of religious history on Taiwan is from 1931 to the island's handover to the Republic of China in 1945. 1931 is of course the year of the so-called Manchurian Incident, when elements of the army stationed in Korea went rogue and invaded northeastern China to set up a puppet state, Manchukuo. Starting in 1931 and then particularly in 1937, once the war in China picked back up, the Japanese state at basically every level became increasingly concerned with mobilizing its citizenry to support the war effort in any and every way possible. This was true on Taiwan as well, where the island was subject to an increasingly severe campaign of what was called kominka, literally and somewhat wordily translated as imperial subjectification. This was a program aimed at transforming the residents of the island into ideal imperial subjects by making them, for lack of a better phrase, more Japanese. For example, forcing a shift towards the use of the Japanese language in public and Japanese-style names for Han Chinese and Aboriginals. Officially, kominka didn't become the policy of the government general until the start of the China War in 1937, but as early as 1931, the same mindset that produced it, mobilizing Taiwan's residents to support the empire and its wars, saw a marked shift in religious policies for the government general. In particular, Taiwan's government began to mandate a program of shrine building around the island, modeled on what was called the Shrine Reorganization Movement in the home islands, a government-mandated program in the first decade of the 20th century that was intended to ensure every village in Japan had one Shinto shrine. In Japan proper, this actually meant shrine consolidation, mostly for financial reasons. If shrines were, in the thinking of the government, a cultural necessity for every village to allow imperial subjects to engage in their patriotic duties, cutting down their numbers was the only way to avoid either massive costs for the government or a huge financial drain for the villages. In Taiwan, by contrast, this meant building new shrines based on the administrative districts set up by the government general. It also meant reworking some existing shrines to keep them more in line with the expectations of a home island-style shrine, most notably Kaizan Jinja, the mausoleum of Kokshinga. In 1936, the government general started a massive rebuild of the Kaizan Jinja site intended to transform it into a Japanese-style shrine, though the original buildings, built in their Fujianese style, were maintained as part of the gardens. The new build was finished in 1941 and became emblematic of this program of the forced Japanization of Taiwan's residents. New shrines also required massive land expropriations and, of course, huge costs, and they never really developed any meaningful following among the Taiwanese residents of the islands. They were largely ignored in favor of existing Taoist or Buddhist temples, the sites torn down and rebuilt after the end of the war, and Japan's surrender. A few were converted by the governing party, the Kuomintang, into veneration sites for martyrs of the revolution, in other words, those who died fighting the Japanese or the communists on the mainland, but most were replaced with more innocuous buildings. Today, only 2 shrine-style buildings exist on Taiwan, both reconstructions made in the 2010s as part of a cultural exchange campaign between the Taiwanese and Japanese populations. Shinto as a religion utterly failed to take root among the natives in any substantial way. And frankly, it's not hard to see why. In Taiwan, just like Hokkaido, the government general treated Shinto in a way that mostly aligned with the basic view of religion that dominated Meiji Japan, as a sort of cultural tool intended to help create good Japanese citizens through its rituals and practices. The difference is that in Hokkaido, most of the people visiting these shrines to learn how to be good subjects were actually Japanese, the Ainu again being very much outnumbered by Japanese settlers. Taiwan, by contrast, never had a huge population of Japanese colonists relative to the existing population. In 1945, Taiwan was home to about 6 million people, The highest estimate I've seen for the number of Japanese residents at war's end was 500,000, so about 8% of the population. Of course, there's another reason Shinto failed to take root on Taiwan. The policies of the government general, the structures of the shrines, all of it was intended to further the goals of Japan on the island. Nothing here really served the locals meaningfully, and so there's no surprise that there was no attachment there. If anything, it's shocking there wasn't more resentment. So this brings us back to where we started. What even is religion and why does it matter in this context? And here I can't help but think of a book I read a few years ago, The Myth of Religious Violence. The core argument is well beyond what I can recount here, but suffice to say that in its basic form, at least as I understood it, the argument is that religion has meant so many things in so many places at so many different times that as a single word describing a phenomenon in human history, it's almost a meaningless category. Ultimately, the author William Cavanaugh therefore argued that religious violence is ultimately always political. It's driven not by belief, but by political systems and structures to which the belief is incidental. And I'm kind of inclined to think that doesn't just apply to religious violence, but to all religion. There's always an element of politics there, and religion itself is such a broad word whose meaning is so dependent on time and place and belief that on its own, it's kind of an empty phrase. For the Meiji state, Shinto was a religion when it was convenient, say, during the Age of the Great Promulgation campaign, but it was not a religion when that was not convenient, say, when dealing with the legal issues created by the Meiji Constitution's Freedom of Conscience Clause. In Hokkaido and Taiwan, Shinto was a religion when that was convenient, for example, by claiming a sort of divine mandate for colonization by way of the three pioneer gods or the soul of Prince Yoshihisa. It was a cultural custom, meanwhile, that could be made obligatory when that was convenient for civilizing the locals. Even in Japan today, Shinto's ambiguity, religion or cultural practice, remains from a legal and really from a day-to-day perspective. What does that even mean going forward for our understanding of religion? Well, that's a talk for another day. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at our website at facingbackward.com and support this show via the History of Japan Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for something very different, the history of one of my favorite hack writers of the Edo period.